Good morning, everybody. I'm David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Business, one of your co-hosts for the day. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and in particular to introduce the academic keynote panel. This is my baby. This is my part of the symposium in addition to the Innovation Showcase. And I take great pleasure in sort of adding to it every year. We've got an interesting mixture of people from the Sloan School and the Media Lab today. But to start things off, I'm going to ask Erik Brynjolfsson to come up to the stage and give a little bit of a TED-like introduction to the panel. Erik is the Schussel Family Professor at the Sloan School of Management. He's the Director of the Center for Digital Business. He's Chair of the Sloan Management Review. He's author of the acclaimed Race Against the Machine book. He's a founder and board member of private and public companies. He's a prolific researcher, and he's just an all-around good guy. So please welcome Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to you a little bit about some of the research we're doing at MIT, both not only at the Center for Digital Business, but we'll hear from panelists who are going to be talking about what's happening in the Lab for Financial Engineering, the Media Lab, the Operations Research Center, and I think we'll have a really interesting discussion. Now, there's been a lot of hype about what's been happening with big data, and what we want to do in this panel, in this discussion, is talk a little bit about the reality of big data. And I think the reality is that this is not simply a revolution in technology, but to be successful, it needs to be a revolution in management and in decision-making and in marketing and manufacturing. Ultimately, it needs to be a revolution in our culture and the way we go about making decisions. So far, that hasn't really been happening to the extent that it needs to happen. And what we want to do in the panel, in the session, is talk a little bit about some of the changes that we see happening already, some of the successful projects and some of the not so successful projects that have happened. Let me begin with an assertion, which is that, let's see, great revolutions in science begin with revolutions in management. These new tools make it possible to change the way we think about the world. And one example is this guy, one of my favorite scientists, Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He was a Dutch scientist who developed one of the most powerful microscopes of his era. And with this microscope, for the first time, he was able to look into a drop of water and see what was in there. And what he saw, as he described, was that the water was almost alive, swimming with animalcules, he called them, so numerous that the whole water almost seemed to be buzzing with activity, all swimming nimbly. Now, when he described this and wrote this up in his letters, and he sent it to the Royal Society of London, nobody really believed him, because as the scientists in the Royal Society said, you know, Anton, you know, we appreciate your letters and all, but it's just not possible to shrink an animal down into a drop of water. So, you know, please, you know, we appreciate your work, but stop sending us these crazy letters. But of course, we know he was correct. There are little creatures that swim around inside water, and he looked into our blood, and we saw that that was also made of cells. And the result was a complete revolution in biology, microbiology, medicine. Many of us probably would not be alive in this room today if it weren't for those improvements in measurement that Anton van Leeuwenhoek brought to that field. Well, today, I think we're on the early stages of an equally big, or perhaps even bigger revolution in measurement. This time, it's not affecting biology, or maybe I should say not just affecting biology, but it's affecting what most of us do, which is management, business, economics, really the whole social sciences, and the information economy more broadly. Because we have a whole new set of tools that allow us to see what's going on inside of our organizations, between our companies, even what's happening inside people's heads as they're thinking about making decisions. Big data is a measurement revolution. And each of us is generating a cloud of information as we walk around with our smartphones, giving information almost continuously about where we are, who we're talking to, and this is generating 2.5 exabytes of information every day. An exabyte is a billion gigabytes of information. That's more information crossing the internet every second now than was in the entire internet just 15 years ago. This information is allowing us to understand what's happening with our customers and with the people who we're interacting with, and understanding what's happening in society. If you look at not just the mobile phone data, but you look at, say, for instance, what's happening with Google searches. There are over 100 billion Google searches each month. And each of those searches is telling us not just what people are buying, but what they're thinking of buying, what they're interested in, what their hopes and aspirations are. It's almost like ESP, and we've been able to successfully use that to make predictions about all sorts of economic activity, and I'll talk about those in a little while. Companies are installing enterprise information systems that track what's going on with their inventory and their supply chains and what's happening inside of their own organizations, and keeping track of email communications and networks. And that is opening up companies and making it visible what's happening inside the black box of organizations in a way that we never could before. And I could go on and on with all these other sources of data, but they are creating orders of magnitude finer resolution, just as the microscope did for biology in terms of what's going on. But to take full advantage, we have to really sit down and think about understanding what we're going to do with that information. And that's why big data also needs to be a management revolution. Here's a quote from Madeline McIntosh from a company that used to be called Random House, which is now out of business. But she talks about how the culture of publishing was very different, the traditional culture of publishing, than what companies like Amazon brought to it. The traditional culture of publishing was what she called a culture of lunches, a culture of conversations, where people had hunches and ideas and they discussed them. Amazon brought a data-driven, a math-driven, a numbers-driven approach to this, and was able to basically eat their lunch, be able to figure out much better what was working, what wasn't working. And that is the way transformation happens in so much of the economy, is not by one company changing its culture, but by one company being displaced by another company that has embraced this new culture. And of course, it's not just happening in book publishing, it's happening in many, many other industries. In some cases, it is by companies embracing this transition. In other companies, it's simply from one part of the industry going out of business and another seizing it. Because one of the facts about revolutions is that revolutions overturn the existing power structure. That's almost the definition of a revolution. And in a revolution, more often than not, the leaders of the companies are the last to fully understand. They're the ones who are most insulated from what's happening on the ground and what's happening in the field. And so too often, the leaders of companies are the last ones to fully appreciate how important it is. It's said that Louis XIV didn't entirely understand that he was in the midst of a revolution until he was stepping up onto the scaffolding and seeing the guillotine and realized, oh my God, this really is a real revolution that's happening. We want to hope that, that our CEOs pick up on it a little before that. Now, Joe Chung talked earlier about the idea of hippos. You guys remember that? Hippos is the way that decisions have been made for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You gather all the relevant people into a room, you have them talk about the issues, they each give their opinions and their judgments and their hunches, and then when you're all done with that conversation, you go with the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. Now, hippos, we need to put them on a diet and change the way they make decisions and turn our hippos into geeks. We need to change the decision-making process from going with hunches and opinions to going with facts and data. And that's something that we're going to be able to do with big data, but it requires a cultural shift. You see it in a number of different areas. I could go through a few different examples. I'll do that quickly. In winemaking, which is maybe, or wine tasting, which is maybe the quintessential human skill, there are human experts like Robert Parker, who sniff the wine and can tell you what the taste of it is, what the quality, the nose, the fragrance. And they've made a reputation on their highly refined skills and sensory abilities. But it's also true that if you really think about it, what is wine? It's a soup of chemicals. And you can analyze it with numbers. And when you do that, companies like Enologics have been able to figure out that you can predict Robert Parker's ratings before he even tastes the wine, before he even opens it, with remarkable accuracy. Another good example that you may have heard of is what's happening in places like insurance underwriting. Kaggle is a remarkable company that brings together data scientists from all over the world, and companies like Allstate will share their data with them and say, hey guys, have at it, see if you can make more sense of this than our hippos, than our experts have. And even though Allstate has a group of people who are very smart, who've been working on this data for literally decades, when they hand it over to the data scientists using more detailed, more advanced algorithms, they were able to get a 340% improvement on the predictions in terms of which cars were likely to be in accidents over time. And that little chart in the middle shows the progression as different teams. Each color change there is a different team of data scientists which had the best algorithm for that time. And you can see there wasn't just one simple breakthrough. It was a whole series of iterative improvements over time as the data scientists were able to make better decisions. And the last brief one I want to mention is the one that really converted me to a true believer in the power of big data, is when I started working with large amounts of Google data to make predictions about the housing market. As I mentioned, there are over 100 billion searches on Google each month, each of them giving some indication of what people are interested in. Many of those searches have to do with housing. People are looking for real estate brokers, mortgages, and other real estate related information. By tracking how frequently those search terms appear by geography, it turns out you can calibrate that to actual housing sales, housing closings. And if you have some data, you can then make predictions about the future. Because if you think about it, before people close on a house, they've already done a bunch of searching. So we would be able to make predictions 3, even to some extent 6 months into the future about what was happening in different real estate markets in the United States in terms of housing sales and housing prices that blew away the traditional housing models, not because we know any more about the housing market, but simply because we had better data. It wasn't so much our hunches and our expertise, it was the very large amounts of data. In this case, the real-time nature of the data, the fact that it was happening very quickly. Now, those are all different kinds of anecdotes and examples, and I could give you many more. But I want to also give you some broader information, because after all, we want to be data-driven. And if you look at a whole set of anecdotes and put them together and analyze them, some patterns start to emerge. And we did a paper with Hee-Kyung Kim and Lauren Hitt, working in conjunction with a team from McKinsey. You'll be hearing later from Michael Shuey, who helped us with this project, and Roger Roberts and others on the McKinsey team. And we asked a set of companies about how they were using big data and how data-driven they were. And we tried to design a questionnaire that would get at how data-driven they really were, whether they were really transforming their culture. We rated all the companies, and we found that the ones that were more data-driven on our questionnaire in terms of their use of data as opposed to intuition to make decisions were on average about 5% more productive than their industry competitors. They also did better on profitability and market value than their industry competitors. So this isn't just a few anecdotes here and there. This is a widespread pattern in the US economy, and we think we'll find similar things when we look at other economies, that on average there's a statistically significant difference. In fact, once we had the metric on how data-driven they were, it was relatively easy for us to look at a whole suite of other metrics, and in each of those, the data-driven companies had a statistically significant improvement over their competitors. Now, it's not all good news, and I want to say there are also some issues around privacy and profiling, and there's some quirky, weird things you can learn from big data. For instance, let me do a little audience poll here. How many people are aficionados of curly French fries? Curly French fries. Anybody here tried those, tasted those? Go ahead, raise your hand. Raise them up high. Don't be shy. Okay. Pretty good. Now, leave them up for a second, because I want everyone to look around at the people who have their hands up. According to a study this spring in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, those people who just had their hands up, on average, have slightly higher IQ than the rest of us. So, excuse me, what's that? Who didn't? Yeah, well, I know. You can look around the people who didn't have their hands up. Yes, you can make your own inferences about that. So there are whole sets of weird patterns there that emerged. And it was a kind of a fun study. They looked at data that's available that all of you have made available publicly, or most of you have made available publicly through your telephone, your Facebook, your other social profiles. Those of you who are tweeting, please send me your tweets for questions. And they were able to make predictions not just about intelligence, you see there. I think there's a, I don't know how well you can see that, the intelligence. The second one, your emotional stability, your conscientiousness, a whole set of metrics. Also some stuff that you might think was sort of personal about, like your sexual preferences, whether your parents were together, whether you're single or in a relationship, your likelihood of being a drug user. All these things could be inferred from the data that's out there. Now I want to, just before you go out and buy a lot of curly French fries, I want to remind you of an important principle, which is correlation is not causality, right? And this is the most common mistake people make when they're using big data, is they see these patterns and they think that they can then make the changes. And just recently we were looking at a study that had something similar to this. Boston, like a lot of cities, has more than its share of potholes. And there's a clever application that was recently developed called Street Bump, which uses the accelerometer that you have in your smartphones and also the GPS. And as you drive around Boston or any other city, it records the bumps. And from that, guess what? You can start seeing where the potholes are, at least the relatively big ones are, in the city. So that's kind of a neat little application. Instead of having the mayor drive around and say, hey, fix that pothole, now you've got everybody working and revealing where those potholes are in more or less real time. But they discovered something unexpected, which is that most of the potholes that they found were in Beacon Hill, in the Back Bay, up around the park. They found relatively few potholes in the poorer parts of Boston. What's going on? Why would that be? You wouldn't expect those areas to have most of the potholes. Anybody? Yeah, exactly. So what's going on is that who's got the smartphones? Well, right now, smartphones are not evenly distributed throughout the population of Boston citizens. They're concentrated in people who live in some of the wealthier areas. So you see a pattern there of where the data comes from is very important. So let me just argue now that big data is driving innovation by changing the way we are making decisions. You have to understand about correlation and causality. You have to understand where the data are. And you need to do not just improve measurement, but also experiment to understand how the data is used, analyze it, replicate what you've learned to go different ways. And we are describing a kind of a new form of management, a management revolution that's based on this more data-driven approach to decision-making and running companies. And each of these principles is becoming cheaper and cheaper and more powerful over time. And we expect it only to grow over the next few decades as Moore's law and other improvements in technology continue exponentially. So to summarize, I want to say that scientific revolutions begin with measurement, but they don't end there. You also need to have a management revolution to change the way decision-making is done. On average, we found that the people who are more data-driven, there is an economically significant difference in their performance, and we expect that to continue as well. But you also have to be careful not to make unwarranted inferences. This is the biggest problem that we're seeing. Correlation is not causality. And finally, there's a new kind of management that we're just beginning to understand, but it differs from relying on hippos and their hunches, and instead is focused on the sequence of measurement, experimentation, analyzing, and replicating. So with that, let me ask the panelists to come on up and join me up here on the table, and we'll have a discussion. Each of them is, their bios are in there, so I'm not going to give a lengthy description, but let me just briefly say that each of them is among the most cited researchers in their fields, and that's sort of the gold standard of how academics measure each other, whether that's in finance or operations research or computer science, respectively. Each of them is the director or the co-director of one of our major laboratories and research centers here at MIT. And each of them, I think you'll find, is a really insightful and interesting person. So let me just mention who they are. I had I guess the names are gone now from the screen, but we've got Dimitris Bertsimas here, Andrew Lowe, and Sandy Pentland. So please join me in welcoming them up here. Now, what I'd like to do is ask each of you a question about some of the things that we've been talking about over the past few days. Let me start with you, Andrew. I know you're one of the preeminent people working in the financial services area. And of course, that's an area that has long had a rich supply of data, maybe one of the most data-driven areas of managed for a number of years. Have you seen a change? Are things changing? Are there things that we can understand better about financial services that we didn't understand before because of big data?
Well, I think there's a huge change. Some of you may have come across a little thing called the financial crisis that we experienced over the last few years.
Was that a result of big data?
Well, yes. I'm not sure if it was a result of big data, but I think that we understand now the power of data. And I should say at the outset that given that this is a forum for CIOs, Chief Information Officers, there's a big difference between information and big data. And the difference is that you have to turn data into information with some kind of interpretation, what you were talking about in terms of management. And one of the difficulties in trying to deal with that in the financial realm is that there are so many different ways of interpreting the data. So we have an enormous amount of data in financial services, but it's only recently that we've begun to take seriously the notion of a financial system as a system. And I know that it seems crazy from the CIO's perspective, since all that you do is kind of a systems approach. But in financial markets, it's relatively recently that we realize that the entire financial system does actually interact as a system. In the past, we focused on banks or hedge funds or insurance companies pretty much separately and in isolation. If you think about how the regulators are organized, they're really organized in a very compartmentalized way. But of course, over the last 5 years, we've seen that those different components have interacted in some very, very unexpected ways. And I think we're trying to map that out right now.
So the regulators used to sort of do a stress test on one particular institution and say how that's doing, but now they're looking at the way that they're connected to each other?
Right. And then those connections, I think, are rather surprising. This is also one of the benefits of big data. So I brought a slide that shows some of those connections.
Can we bring that up? Is that... Can we bring up the slide? I'm sure we can. There it is.
Yeah, so this is a slide of connections between three types of entities: insurance companies, sovereign countries, and banks. The connections really represent statistically significant correlations between the rates of return of banks in 1 month versus sovereign debt in another month, as well as across insurance companies and so on. And so this is data from 2004 to 2006, 3 years of data. And what's displayed are only the most significant correlations across time, so the 1% level. So you see that from 2004 to 2006, the network of connections among these three types of institutions, sovereign debt, banks, and insurance companies, is dense in some areas, but it's sparse in other areas. Now let me show you what it looks like over the course of the last 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, a little bit of a difference. This graph is incredibly dynamic, and it really underscores the fact that the financial system is now connected in ways that we never anticipated, and those connections can change from month to month, in fact, day to day. So we're only now at the very beginnings of trying to understand how to map the financial system, how to map this network, and to use all of the tools of network science, tools that have been pioneered by Sandy, Dimitri, and others, to truly understand what's going on in the financial system.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. So let me say I'm going to open this up to questions from all of you, and also I've got my Twitter feed set up here. If you want to send them by Twitter, the hashtag is #MITCIO, or you can send it to me, Erik Bryn, ERIKBRYN. But let me turn to Dimitris here, who is the co-director of the Operations Research Center, which is kind of the granddaddy of analytics research centers. What year was that founded? Back in
1953.
1953, okay. So I don't know what big data was in 1953, but I imagine it's changed a little bit. In the description of the panel, it talked about how big data can cure cancer. I know Andrew Lowe has actually done some of that, but we were talking, you have something to say on that as well. How can big data help cure cancer?
Well, that's something that I have a lot of personal interest on. So after, in the 70s, when then President Nixon declared war on cancer, unfortunately the reality is that still we haven't made, as a society, a huge amount of progress on that. And if you look how the major knowledge on cancer proceeds, it's primarily through the intuition, as opposed to a big data exercise of researchers, doctors, oncologists around the world who create clinical trials based on intuition.
So, Mike here.
Hopefully you heard me. I don't know where you lost me.
That is better with that, yeah.
So key aspect so far has been that progress in creating new treatments for advanced cancers is based on intuition of doctors. So our idea was to create a database of the vast majority of clinical trials that happened from 1970 until today, primarily because chemotherapy utilizes drugs that are used again. So drug A and B have been used, drug B and C has been used, B, C, and F has been used, and maybe one question could be what potential other combination could bring in terms of providing improved results on toxicity and, most importantly, survivability of patients. So, and of course, this approach will be relatively silent on new discoveries, but once a drug has been seen, it can give intuition on combinations and their effectiveness. So, so big data, therefore, so we created, it was a multi-year effort to create a database of this nature, where utilizing natural language processes, you read from academic papers, and there are tens of thousands of papers that have been written on oncology, and you create a database that has information on that. And you can find from that quite interesting, let me give you an example of a new insight that potentially could be generated.
You want to bring the slide up? So if we could do that.
So, so the idea is as follows, that
There it is.
if, let's say, somebody is diagnosed with cancer at, in an advanced form, so what people do primarily? They go to a doctor, they entrust their life to their hands, and if you ask, you know, a few years back, my father was diagnosed with gastric cancer, so we went around the country and tried to find appropriate treatments for him. It was an advanced case. So Sloan Kettering has one treatment, Dana-Farber has another treatment, Mass General Hospital has another treatment, often disjoint. So the question is what to do. So, so a data approach can help that. For example, without going into too many details, if you look at the graph, there are two axes. There is toxicity. There's a measure of toxicity. The details are not that important. And the vertical is survivability in months. And each combination of drugs can be put in this framework. So you can see an efficient frontier there. You can see that the data gives you, this is simple analysis, a perspective about trade-offs between toxicity and survivability.
So the green dots there are so your best combinations, the ones that have the most survivability for a given level.
And this is directly from the data without analysis. However, suppose you have now a man in its 50s of Asian descent, of certain weight, and so forth. Can you then utilize analysis to then propose new, better treatments? Because now the efficient frontiers, if you have models that utilize the data and can predict outcomes for specific people, then you could actually personalize the story. A final point where data, big data can help in this. So what we have tried is that we have developed, based on the data, then we can build a model of, suppose treatment A, B, and C is for this particular cancer, what do you expect the toxicity and survivability to be? So then, in that context, we have a model that we can then consider, first of all, for prediction. So this could guide decisions about do you do this treatment or the other treatment, but most importantly, over a horizon of time, which treatments do you design based on the totality of data to improve outcomes for patients, both on survivability and toxicity in this way.
Wow. Well, it feels like we're back in school a little bit there to learn a little bit about how those trade off. Thanks. Let me turn to you, Sandy. I have the pleasure of co-teaching a course on data science, exec ed course with Sandy, and it's always fun to hear about what he's up to. And some of the interesting things is you're doing a lot of work not just in the United States, but in the rest of the world. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the rest of the world.
Sure. Yeah. So my history is I've been doing a lot of things with mobile phones for a long time. Co-founder of the largest location-based service outside of Google and Facebook, and sit on the boards of Motorola Mobility and Telefonica. And what I hear all the time is that people are interested in using mobile phone data for monetizing in various ways, for better navigation, for logistics, for all sorts of plans, but they're also very scared of using it because of public reaction. You use your phone for your purposes. What are they doing selling my data to these other people? And so there's a sort of conundrum there. There's this huge reservoir of data about human behavior and social network patterns that come off of mobile phones. It covers virtually every adult in the world. It makes Facebook look small in comparison, but there's a social barrier against using it. And so earlier this year, I worked with Orange, the large carrier, the United Nations Global Pulse, which is concerned with data, and the World Economic Forum, to create what is really the first big data commons. So this is big data that a commercial entity releases out into the public and for creating public good. And the idea, if we could have the first slide here, from Orange's point of view is that if they can show that the data they have creates public goods, people will get used to the fact that there is this resource for society, and then Orange can begin to sell premium services on top of that, and that will become an acceptable thing. So they have to get buy-in from companies, from citizens, and from government. And so what we did is we released data for the entire country of the Ivory Coast. So it's around 20 million people. You might remember that the Ivory Coast had a civil war that ended just only a year ago. And examples of things that we found that we could do with it, and this was a combination effort of almost 90 universities, was we could get a 10 reduction in commute time by just rearranging the bus routes. It turns out nobody had ever known where people originate and what their destination is. Those pairs were never measured. There was no way to do it. You just look at traffic at particular points. When you looked at the OD matrices, very simple changes could reduce the commute time by 10%.
And you knew where they were because they had cell phones.
Because they had cell phones. Similarly, the public health people were amazed because the ways that they were dealing with malaria, with HIV, with infectious disease could be improved by 20%. In terms of infection rate and total number of infections, because again, they knew the mobility patterns of people. They never thought that people went from A to B, or they didn't think there were many people, and now they could see what was happening. And so this is creating public goods, which people can really experience. Go to the next one. So one of the most interesting things is that people have a regular behavior, and this has been verified in many different countries. As you become more wealthy, you engage in more exploratory behavior. You call a more diverse set of people. You move around more. And so you can use those measurements to make essentially a census map, a real-time census map of the entire country. So you can do what is called a multi-phasic poverty index for the entire country, where you can see where each little county, how well they're doing and how well they're not. And so from government's point of view, they go from a complete ignorance. There hasn't been a census there in decades. They've had a civil war. Things obviously changed. Government has no idea what's happening in its own country, and now they can see that. At the same time, this has some sort of controversial things, because...
Well, actually, but before you get into the controversial things, I just want to understand a little bit about what's the revenue model, what's the benefit? So Orange is doing, it sounds like, a lot of work with you. You're a researcher, so I kind of understand why you're doing it. What's in it for them?
So for Orange, if people get used to the fact that the data that Orange collects is useful as a public good, then, and that Orange has been generous in donating this, what they begin to do is build business off of this. So people who are delivering things, logistics industries, will begin using this public data to route their trucks.
So you want to try and give rise to kind of an ecosystem of
information. An ecosystem of using this digital data. And of course, the guys who do logistics will immediately notice that if they had higher resolution data, they could save a lot of money.
Okay,
so higher resolution data is going to cost
This is the free
something.
version, and if you want the really good stuff, you pay a little more.
Pay a little more, that's right. And there's a bigger play too, which is that I know that very senior people in the UK and France and other places would love to have this sort of thing, but it's politically controversial.
Right. Well, I was thinking, I mean, I was meeting with Robert Groves at the US Census, and they do have a paper-based census, and they go out and call people, but they have nothing with the level of detail you just described for the Ivory Coast.
That's right, and how quickly you can do it, and that's tremendously good for business, particularly for the sort of delivery and investment and real estate. So the idea is to sort of show that it works, show that it's safe, and then get people used to it and create this brand new business, which is anticipated to be as larger than the base business. Now, the controversial bit is the last bit on that slide, which is it turns out that different language groups, different ethnic groups keep to themselves. So they talk to themselves more than they talk to other people. So you can actually plot out all of the lines of ethnic divisions. And of course, in Ivory Coast, those were the cause of a war. Hundreds of thousands of people died along those boundaries. They could never see them before because they didn't have any census data. They never knew where they were. Now they know where the ethnic boundaries are, where conflict is likely to happen. And you can begin to take solutions like, well, maybe you can promote communication between the different ethnic groups. You have to know where they are first, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's fascinating. So I want to encourage you, if you have questions, just feel free to come right up to the microphones and line up. I'll start getting questions also from Twitter, as well as corrections on my pronunciation of orange, I have just discovered here. So, so feel free to either send them to me or line up over there. Let me get into one question that we had from this, and also we've been noodling with for some time, which is, as you get more and more data, do models become less important or even irrelevant? Does that mean that you can throw enough data at it and don't have to worry as much about the models? Why don't I just go with you, Andrew?
Yeah, so I think not, at least in the financial realm. I don't think it's going to be a situation where we can dispense with models, particularly as we start looking at broader and broader phenomenon. In the case of cancer, that's sort of a good case in point.
Right.
If you look at the data, you'd find that there's a shocking correlation between lung cancer and the fact that you have ashtrays at home. So that would suggest that if you eliminate all the ashtrays, you could cure lung cancer. And that's an example of your point that correlation is not causation. There are situations, though, where having lots and lots of data will allow you to do experiments in ways that you couldn't otherwise conduct, and therefore models become less important simply because you can actually see the dynamics of the data more quickly. A case in point is high-frequency trading.
Okay. Yeah, good. Actually, that was one of the questions I also got from my brother, John Brynjolfsson. I wanted to ask about models in high-frequency trading, so I'm glad you're addressing that.
So it's interesting. If you look at the high-frequency traders that are out there, virtually none of them have any kind of economics or finance backgrounds. They're almost all of them computer scientists, mathematicians, and physicists. And the reason for that is because with lots and lots of high-frequency data, you can do experiments in real time. And if it turns out that you've got a bad forecasting model, in a matter of a few hours, you've collected lots and lots of data points, so you can actually.
What do you mean by an experiment? I mean, what does that mean in that context?
Well, it literally means running a trading strategy that's at the millisecond frequency, and you run that over the course of a couple of days. That's enough to collect enough evidence to see statistically whether or not you've got predictability or not.
So you try a certain trading strategy,
Exactly.
see if it gives you excess returns.
Right. Now, at the level of high-frequency trading, having large amounts of data and being able to do experiments is actually a very natural thing to do. But if you're now trying to manage an economy, you're trying to understand systemic risk, you can't really do the same type of experiments. What you can do is to look at consumer credit data, look at home prices, mortgage applications. You can look at that on a massive scale and get a sense of where the economy is moving. But nevertheless, you need to have some kind of a filter to be able to interpret that so as to turn correlation into causation when you can.
What about all this data that's being gathered from electronic medical records, electronic health records? I think probably each of you has worked with those in different contexts. Is there an opportunity there to change the way we make healthcare decisions? You want to weigh in on that, Sandy?
So I have a sort of a handshake to begin a very large project with the head of Mass General Internal Medicine. The problem in a lot of healthcare is that the disease categories are traditional. They're not, and apparently, as people have investigated more and more, a lot of the diseases are not unitary things. Like depression is probably 4 or 5 different things. Diabetes is not just one disease, it's several diseases, but we don't know which things are which. And it was hoped that genetic information would distinguish between them, but it's been too complicated. But the evidence suggests that if you have behavior data along with genetic data, then you can parse things out into their actual categories, and all of a sudden you should be able to find out the sort of things that Dimitri was talking about with a homogeneous population.
And how do you get the behavior data, although I think I can guess?
Well, I'm going to get it off of cell phones. I'm going to get it off of credit cards, things like that, so I know what people buy, where they go, what sort of food they eat, things like that. And that gives us a sense of the sort of behavior that the person has, along with genetic information. And then over a large population, you can look at
start seeing
outcomes.
Patterns as these all match together. Although you still got to be careful about these spurious correlations, I imagine, right?
Yeah, but the point is that we don't actually have even good hypotheses at this point about what things might be out there.
So this kind of brings this scientist's attention to, hey, here's this striking correlation. Maybe there's some causal relationship or not, but at least let's take a closer look at it.
That's right, yeah.
We got a question here. Go ahead.
Hi, Frank Murphy, TVG Security. We've run into the same paradigm with data as at rest is benign, but once you start correlating that data, you run into security issues, meaning PII, patient information, compliance issues around PCI and HIPAA. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, that's a great question. I mean, that's certainly, and I think all of us wanted to get into some of the privacy and other issues. Who wants to hit that first? Go ahead.
Let me take a crack at it, because that's an area that affects both healthcare as well as financial services. Privacy is a huge issue with regard to big data, and I think I'm sure all of you have heard the example of the case of Target and the woman that was identified as being pregnant before her parents even knew that that was the case, just based upon her purchases.
Right.
In my view, the way to deal with this issue is really through cryptography. That's about the only way that we can ensure privacy to a level that people are going to be comfortable with. And in some recent research that I've been doing with some co-authors, we've used cryptographic methods to create so-called secure multi-party computation, where you can allow multiple parties to be able to encrypt their data and then pool that encrypted data and yet still be able to compute aggregate statistics that are going to be very useful for, say, systemic risk management or measurement. The same thing is true for healthcare.
Let me just make this clear. So you can get these aggregate statistics, but you can't back out who it was the person with AIDS, or who was the person who was the drug user, or whatever.
Exactly. So one simple example is, in this room right now, we can probably guess as to what the average salary is of all of the people in the room. But in order for us to compute it, you would think that each of us would have to share our own private information about our salaries. But there's actually a way for each of us to encrypt our salary information, send it into a central server, and then have the server aggregate that and actually be able to compute the correct average without ever having to jeopardize the privacy of each of our individual
And could you also
salaries.
find correlations, like whether that was correlated with curly French fries or something else?
Certainly you can. The challenge, though, is that with all of these methods, it increases the computational burden. And so you want to look for efficient algorithms to do the encryption.
Although computation is one thing that's getting cheaper pretty fast.
That's right. exactly. And so I think that in order to prevent big data from becoming Big Brother, what we want to do is to make sure that we protect the privacy of individuals. And I think that there are methods now for being able to do that. And a lot of the people here at MIT at CSAIL has been doing some really interesting work in that area.
Let's take a question from here, and we'll come back and talk some more about that. Over here on my right.
Tom Atkinson. I'm with Internoc. My question is around enterprise data for corporations. We have, in your first slide, you mentioned ERP systems, financial systems, CRM systems.
Yes.
What are some examples of ways that we can use big data concepts in support or with respect to that financial data, customer data, enterprise data?
Yeah, so there's a whole flood of that information that's becoming available because companies are basically instrumenting their operations, and so things are becoming digitized. Do people have some examples that they want to talk about of using enterprise data in that way?
Well, I have some examples of things that go wrong.
Okay.
I co-lead the big data discussion for the World Economic Forum, and so we get a lot of the big data people, Palantir and people like that showing up. And pretty uniformly, people say that about 80% of the cost in building these systems is around getting things out of silos, making sure the permissions are correct, denoising it, getting it to be a sort of a uniform format, and then only 20% of it is actually doing the work that you wanted to. And what this suggests is that people need to take very seriously moving to something you might call a data flow architecture, where there aren't archives. All data is live. Data isn't siloed. Data is put into one format that's accessible across all the different branches of the enterprise. And at that point, then you could begin hunting for correlations and tracking down things that might be causation. And typically, that's been quite profitable for people. But that big transformation to making everything available needs to happen first.
Great. Dimitris, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's happening in crime detection, because I know that you did some work in trying to predict that. That sounds kind of futuristic, but it also opens up some of these issues about Big Brother as well. But why don't you tell us what's doable there?
What I know is the following.
Why don't you bring the mic a little closer?
Okay, so I was involved in a project with the Boston Police Department, in which after every event, there is a lot of data information that is happening almost within real time. So policemen write reports, they come to a central facility, and our research has shown that by taking all this data historically and combining also with data from releases from prison, so primarily because a lot of crime is involved with gangs and people that enter and re-enter the prisons regularly, combining all of this and taking a big data approach, we can improve the prediction for various types of crimes, both very short term as well as monthly, let's say. That's a particularly useful thing for allocation of resources, capabilities. And down the road, potentially for discovering terrorist activities.
Mm-hmm. So this is profiling in many ways, so right?
Profiling, but at some point, it's the majority of the effort is on trends and spatial and temporal correlations.
Looking at behavior.
Looking at behavior on the aggregate. If you want now to, if you have information about who is being released, the prior behaviors and so forth, you have improved prediction.
Well, it starts raising some interesting questions about what kind of society we're going to be. If you start being able to predict what people are going to do before they do it, when do you start holding them liable?
I wouldn't go that far.
That's a whole different, or you make predictions about, well, but Sandy wants to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so I've been involved in a couple of things. So for instance, we have a system we deployed in Afghanistan that was very successful, that I can't talk about. But we also worked with UK intelligence agencies, and they actually do proactive prediction of crime. So they look at people who've been released and their pattern of communication, and they have certain signals which they believe and statistically are significantly predictive of crimes that are about to happen. And they include things like patterns of communication among known criminals.
Right.
And so their approach to that is not to arrest people because nothing's happened, but to make sure, because they also have location information, they deploy a lot more police to those regions.
Well, Britain, they already
particular people.
There's a lot of cameras around everywhere. They already have a...
Yeah, but it raises a question because all of a sudden these people are people of interest simply because they've been texting each other independent of what the text says.
So we should be careful about what kinds of texts we send to each other.
You should, yes.
We're undoubtedly being watched, right? So there's a number of interesting questions have come in. There's some here. Let's try and get them quickly.
Sure. This question is generated by the chart that we saw earlier.
And say your name.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is David Volan with the Cavan Group. Generated by the charts that you showed up there regarding the Ivory Coast. Now, I assume if you're going to be gathering data from a smartphone or cell phone, that at the very least, the device has to be powered on. That seems to make sense. And certainly, you're going to be able to gather data on how a person travels when they're actually talking on the telephone. How does this device gather data and is it made available when there are no applications running on that phone at all?
This particular data is what's called CDR data, so it's not smartphone data. It's just regular feature phone, although smartphones produce CDRs too. So you're correct that they don't produce CDRs if they're powered off, but their nascent state is quite low power, so people leave them on commonly, right? You can't get an incoming call if it isn't in that wait state. So what you get to see as a consequence is you get to see people transitioning from one cell tower to another. You don't know precisely where they are, but you get to see, oh, they started from here and they went to there and they went to there. And also it turns out that there's a lawful statistical relationship between patterns of calls and patterns of mobility. So you can actually predict one from the other to a certain extent, which is another characteristic of humans. Right? And so those are the heart of what that data is about. And then what happened is it was chopped up in a way that made it very difficult to re-identify anything, even with other data sets. Because privacy is, of course, a huge thing in a country that still has the AK-47s.
So I have a more philosophical kind of question that's come in electronically. We're all kind of fans of what can be done with big data, but there are limits to big data, not just some of the issues around privacy and data ownership, but just things that aren't knowable or haven't been instrumented yet. And you think about the example that was given here by Bob Scheer was that when Obama had to make the decision whether to strike Osama bin Laden, he didn't have complete information, or when Steve Jobs makes a decision about new product introductions, he doesn't have billions of data points that he can rely on. So what is the natural balance? There must be some decisions that are better made, or that have to be made without big data. What's the trade-off? What's the balance there?
Well, you've had, I forget the fellow's name, was in charge of the casino that you've had.
Yeah, Gary Loveman.
So he made a very clear point, which was big data is good for interpolation. So if you're in a domain that you understand, but it's bad for extrapolation.
Right.
Because it's a new area, so you don't know what the correlations are.
Exactly. So he gave the example, he can make interpolations about, like what you did, Dimitris, about different combinations of drugs and so forth, but going to something new that hasn't been done before. The example that Gary Loveman gave, the CEO of Caesars, is that they were looking at a new casino in Macau, and just looking at the existing data, there hadn't been all that much gambling or enough to justify the price. But his gut told him there could be some value there. The data told him no. He ended up not making the investment, but in that case, it turned out that his gut was right and the data were wrong, and he missed a huge opportunity because the data just weren't sufficient for making that kind of extrapolation. Yeah. How about a question
Charlie
here?
Best with Hewlett Packard, and it seems like the more we apply data to management techniques and organizational behavior, the more we can begin to separate out the normal from the anomaly and automate management. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Would like to weigh in on that?
Sure.
Brief answer.
We make these little badges that
sociometric badges.
Sociometric badges that it's a spin-off company that people use, like they're just name badges, but they record where people go and if there are conversations. And what we find is the patterns of communication in an organization are extremely predictive of productivity and creative output and disasters also, which you might expect because after all, communication is a sort of a core fabric that holds things together. And so what these little badges do is they give you a little dashboard that shows you that nobody's talking to customer service, or these guys are, you know, not talking to each other and they're probably not all on the same page, and so on and so forth. So to a fair degree, you can automate things like office layout to promote higher productivity. You can automate interactions to promote greater creative output. So we've done that with a pharmacy company with their drug discovery. Just making sure that the right people are talking to the right people. So it's not automating all of management, but it's automating a lot of the nuts and bolts by taking care of the stuff you can't quite normally see or know what's going on. So in that sense, management is getting much more data-driven, at least in that particular example.
So all of you are doing path-breaking research, but you're also all professors and teachers. Should we change the way we teach data scientists, teach statistics? Are we training enough people in these fields? And how does our industry need to change to keep up with this demand for data scientists? I know that you've got a program there, Dimitris.
Yeah, so it's a definite yes on the question. We should consider changing the way we teach, primarily because the current way we teach is small data, model building on small data sets. So we are thinking here at MIT to start a new program, we call it a master's program in analytics, in which we combine computer science concepts, operational research concepts, statistics concepts, computer science, databases, and so forth, and as well as combination with industry, where the students develop what they learn in an internship environment, and then they apply it back in a project or a thesis environment here at MIT that involves expertise from all parts of MIT, from statistics, computer science, the previous things that I mentioned. And we feel that there's enough data to support the hypothesis that such people would be in great demand in the years to come, and our intention at MIT to at least partially fulfill that.
And you've done something with financial engineering, Andrew.
Right, we have a master's in finance at the Sloan School, where we are now introducing a lot of these concepts at a much earlier stage to students that really just right out of college, but are interested in becoming experts in finance. The one thing that we've seen, and the one concern that I have, is that most students that come to MIT have a shockingly low background in preparation in really basic statistics.
Even at MIT.
Even at MIT. And it's really disturbing because, you know, with all of the things that we're doing with big data, just a very basic understanding of statistical inference is just so important, and we don't have that.
Yeah, this is sort of a pet peeve of mine as well. As I look at the high school curriculum in America, and really throughout the world, it's a lot of it seems to be based on, you know, trigonometry or calculus and things that, I don't know, most people don't use that much in their daily lives, but almost everybody now uses statistics. Even if you just want to read the newspaper, and the level of statistical literacy is so low that we should probably think about not just changing the college education, which we're working on, but really revamping K through 12 as well.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about randomness is actually pretty challenging. And most of the high school curricula that I've seen really doesn't prepare you for thinking in a really different way.
I think most of them learn it outside of high school when they're playing poker. I think that's probably the best one.
They learn it the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. You got to learn fast.
I teach an entrepreneurship class that focuses on big data. In fact, two. One that focuses big data outside of the rich countries, and one that focuses in the rich countries. And what I try to do is get Sloan fellows, so people who've had a little experience, typically with some technical background, and mix them with people from the rest of MIT, the double E's, the Meckies, the things like that. And the challenge is to think about what sorts of applications, what sorts of things that you could do by combining big data analytics in different contexts. And it's sort of the way I keep myself informed about what are the thought patterns going on.
Good. Well, we're just about out of time here. I want to give each of you a chance, if you want, to make any sort of prediction about the future or anything you see happening in the next 5 years. Here's a chance to use what you've been seeing to say something about what you think might be happening going forward, something we should be looking out for. No?
I'm very, very optimistic, and perhaps too optimistic, that a lot of the things around privacy and data ownership will be taken care of. So you've seen the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights in this country. I know the things that are happening in the EU. I've also been involved in things in China, which you might not expect.
Right.
And
when you say data ownership, really treating information like an asset, kind of like other kinds of
So
assets.
that giving people more control over it so that it's a more opt-in framework with the ability to audit, sort of the way you would treat money. Using some of the techniques that Andrew talked about for encryption while you add, because the real challenge here is making the data available. That's where all the cost is. That's where a lot of the brand risk is. That's where a lot of the things that are holding up the whole show are.
Yeah.
So you have to make it so that people are willing to contribute data, share data in a safe manner in order to realize this big data
Well, that
world.
gets to what I started the panel with, which is that this is not just a technology revolution, it's an institutional management and organizational revolution.
So from the financial perspective, I'm quite optimistic that over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to be building a much more robust financial system. But over the shorter term, between the next 1 to 5 years, I think it's going to be Moore's Law versus Murphy's Law. I think we're actually going to be seeing another financial dislocation sometime within the next 12 or 20
Well, that chart you showed said that, if anything, things are getting more interconnected.
And the problem is that over the last year or two, the S&P has done really well. So, of course, now there's no problem anymore, right? The financial markets are just fine. So we're actually going to need another crisis to get us to the point where we actually implement some of these ideas.
Well, that's an optimistic prediction. Okay.
My own prediction, I mean, the field I represent has been from the 1950s, right? And I believe this is a transformational moment for the field of analytics and the use of quantitative methods in business. So my prediction is that in the next 10 years or so, this will further increase, further strengthen, and the demand for people like the MIT graduates will further increase. That's my...
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the safest prediction in there. So, well, thanks very much. I appreciate all of you for joining us at the panel and continuing questions.